Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the BOR podcast. I'm your host, Mike Bell. Hey, just want to give a shout out to everybody that tuned in for the last podcast last week. Thank you for tuning in. Also, special plug in. Be sure for us to make sure that you're checking us out on our website. That's bor-kingdom.com for information about past events, upcoming events. Again, that's bor-kingdom.com. So as we get into today's podcast, we got a lot of stuff to talk through, but try to keep it short. So there's a couple of points that we'll go through today, just to kind of follow up on. So going over BOR concept again, some a little bit of moments of transparency. We're going to talk about discipline, schedules, things like that, mindset. So we're going to get into that today. So without further ado. Just want to, again, thank everybody for tuning in. So with putting together this BOR concept, one of the things that, I realized in just a moment of transparency within myself, just realizing that discipline, right? I had gotten off structured, off discipline, with some of the things that I set up, right? And what I realized that I had a certain level of expectation of outcomes, but I had lost sight on just being disciplined. Right. And it was creating levels of frustration within myself. So then I was, more frustrated with other people, not necessarily just because of what I felt was kind of triggering in the moment. But the reality of it was that it was self-reflective for me, that there were some outcomes for myself, expectations for myself that, I hadn't been fulfilling. And that's because I realized, and I sat and I realized I've lost sight of my discipline for myself. So just working in through that. So I had to be real. I had to take a look at myself like, man, why am I more agitated and frustrated than, I normally am? Why does it feel like, small things are triggering me, and this, that, and the other? And although there's a lot of personal stuff that's going on, within my life. So a lot of different things, whether it's, with kids and, past things, my mom passing and everything else, right? There's a lot of, high intense, situations occurring that adds to it. But what I realized that a lot of my frustration wasn't necessarily just coming from these events, but that there was a level of expectation I had on myself and a level of fulfillment that wasn't being fulfilled and wasn't being completed in my own personal life. So because of that, it placed the blame on in areas and situations that weren't necessarily the blame. I had to take a self-reflection that I'm the reason that I didn't, I'm not pursuing and fulfilling and this, that, and the other. I lost focus. I lost sight. And so because of that, it then led to some internal, unhappiness, not because, I wasn't necessarily happy, but because I was missing, that level of fulfillment, in my life. And, there's a difference between roles, duties, responsibilities, and then also things that make us feel fulfilled. For instance, you can be a provider, right? You can provide safety and security. You can cook at home and clean at home and everything else, right? And so just because you're completing tasks or responsibilities within your role doesn't mean that within itself is bringing you fulfillment, right? For some people, they feel fulfilled, that is their validation of self. That is their purpose. That, hey, my purpose is to make sure that the home is the house feels like a home, and to organize the home, right? And so when they're doing those things, there's a level of fulfillment. Then you have for others where, like for myself, that, there's a lot of calling and fulfillment being an ordained pastor, right? And being a community leader and community advocate, there's some level of fulfillment and validation in doing what I was called to do. And so when I'm not as disciplined and not as structured, and not doing some of those things, what happens is that I lose sight and focus on doing that. And because of that, internally feeling that frustration. And although I can go through a list of, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that and I'm doing this and, all of those things, whether you're, when you're explaining it to the rest of the family, you have a list of things that you're doing, but the frustration isn't about just the list of things you're doing. It's sometimes about the unfulfillment. At least for me, it was like, I'm missing fulfillment. And because I've been distracted and because, I haven't been disciplined, that's the real thing, is I hadn't been disciplined to make sure I was taking time to do those things that are fulfilling, right? To do those things that, that I was called to do, right? And so when I'm not doing those things, I realized I was a little more frustrated. So there's just a moment of transparency for myself, right? So getting in and realizing that, making sure I'm staying in with, my therapist and getting that, that help there as well, and staying consistent and disciplined on doing that. And then also my weekly schedule. I had to retake a look at my weekly schedule, and see, am I following what I set up for the week, right? Am I following, everything should be written in there. Am I getting up? Am I working out? Am I, I'm eating healthy and doing all the other things. I go to work, within my scheduled time, I do this, I do that, but, where's my allotted time, for self, where, not just squeezing it in. How can I be intentional about my time on self-development, my free time, my personal time, right? How many hours a week am I reading a book, and what times are structured into that I should be reading my book or writing my book, or, these other things. So because those things go uncompleted or incomplete, or unfulfilled, right now there's a level of internal frustration within myself. So, but if I were to write it out, and you can utilize, AI, right? Chat GPT, and say, hey, these are the things I need, structured within my week. Help me to structure my week. And put it in there, write it in there, right? And then at the end of that, follow that structure, stay disciplined. A lot of times we get to a point where we feel like, action and transaction, right? If I do this thing, it should, result in this immediate, transaction. And oftentimes that's not the case, right? It's the discipline, that really allows to manifest and to bring into being, some of those things that, we want to be. So, I look at LeBron James a lot, right? And, not just LeBron James, there's many others as well. And I like ET as well, right? But when I hear him talk about discipline, when I hear LeBron talk about discipline, right? LeBron James may say, hey, I get up in the gym and I'm so disciplined, right? It doesn't mean that just because I go in the gym for a month straight, that my 3-point shot just increases, drastically, because I decided for a month I'm going to practice on my 3-point shot. No, he understands that it starts with mindset. And, I go in, I may have a small increase. It may take me a month just to realize that my footing was off, right? And then it'll take me another month or two to realize that, my release time was off, right? It may take a couple of months after that to realize other things, but because of my discipline, now I'm able to adjust, and now I'm able to see those mini growths, right? And get forward to the full-time growth. And so within that, getting back to a point of being disciplined, write my schedule out. When am I waking up, jogging, working out in the morning, when am I going to work? When am I spending time with the family? When am I working on my book? When am I taking me time? So now those things, getting back to having those things scheduled out throughout the week. So if you don't have that, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Your day-to-day, your week should be scheduled out. Now, I understand some things may change, right, within the plan, but you have a plan for the week. And if something were to adjust, it's not 100% of your schedule is adjusting. It's you're now making time where something small may need to adjust because something that came up. And then you'll get better at anticipating when things are going to come up, and how to project for things that may come up, right? I do a lot within business organization, within being an executive, right? At the end of the day, I have to project what's coming up for the year, right? And you finish that budget before the year even comes, right? And you're looking not only 1 year, but 2 year, 3 years into the future. So when I'm doing that for, the companies I work for, right, I have to write that budget out. I have to understand what's coming up. How do we anticipate what may come up? And you get better and better over time at doing that. And then when something happens, right, I have to adjust. Now, how do we adjust to what just occurred? I couldn't fully anticipate that this would have occurred, but now that it has, now we have to adjust. But it shouldn't be an every time thing that every week, or every month I constantly have to adjust to something. That means that I didn't do a proper job at planning out in advance, planning out my schedule, and that I, utilize proper tools to make sure I had all the information I needed. So when I made my plan or when I made my projections, that, I can anticipate, or I can make sure that I'm projecting as accurately as possible, so I can stay in that, that maybe 80-90% or so, projection rate with maybe just a 5 to 6% variance, 8 at max variance on where I projected, based on where I ended up within that year, within that month. Right. I may have a bad month, but guess what? That following month, we're going to catch up. I may have a bad quarter, but that following quarter, we're going to catch up. Right. And so that's the way that we work, where sometimes it may be, hey, I didn't get to work out as much as I wanted to this week, but that next week, we're going to catch up. That next week will be good. We'll get back on track, right, to make sure that we're back on track. And you can't always make up for what was done in the past or the time missed in the past. Right. So you can't make up for 3 months of missed time working out, and all of a sudden you're just working out every day to make up for that time. But you get yourself back on track. And it may take a little bit longer, for you to finish up the project, but you're back on track now. Now you have a new adjusted, projected date, for completing your goal. So that discipline, that mindset, making sure you're structured, making sure you have that discipline, and doing that, build your schedule out. And figuring out, so even for me within family dynamics of, blended families, right? There's a lot of stuff. What does that look like for us? How do we structure expectations, roles, everything else? Because it looks different today than it used to back in the day, right? It's not just a standard role, standard expectation. But I have to realize within myself, like, as we continue to grow and build, what will this look like in the future? As the CEO of my family, of my family structure, it's my responsibility to write out the goal, right? Where am I headed? Right? Where is the business headed? Where is the family going to be headed? How do we bring these things together? Right. And there's so many things within a CEO of that role and responsibility that it's your job to forecast, right? The projections, the goal, of where we're headed, where we're going, and then, having someone on your team, or whether that's yourself or wherever that COO, to actualize it, right? To carry out the mission and the vision of the CEO, right? But then that CEO is building that relationship. It's building, those resources to be able to bring in, right? The casting out the vision, making sure the vision is plain, make sure it's clear, make sure everybody understands their role and their expectations, and being able to follow up with that throughout your family structure. So taking that on and saying, okay, as the CEO for this business, for my relationship, it's my job to cast out the future. If you're with someone and you're saying, hey, one day I want to get married, and, one day I want us to have a family together, or one day I want us to blend our families together, what does that look like? How do you cast that vision? If they're going to follow you and follow your leadership, right? What does that vision, what vision are they following? Or are they just following a bunch of desires, right? Oh, I want the nice house, and I want the nice car, and I want, this level of income, and, I want to be able to go on trips and everything else. Cool. Absolutely. All right. So you got a whole lot of desires, and you guys are on the same page that you want to live in a nice neighborhood and go to good schools, and, you want to create generational wealth. Cool. What does that look like? What's the plan to get there? Or do we just have a bunch of ideas, and even if you have some minor plans, like, some suggestions on things that we could do, yeah, we're going to invest, and we're going to save, and we're going to work and have businesses. Great. Those are ideas of how you plan on getting. Now, what's the actual plan? What are the actual projections? How do I sit back and look and say, hey, are we on target to meet where we need to be financially, mentally, within, development of the kids and everything else? What does that plan look like? And how do we check to see if we're in line on that plan? So now that becomes a part of the CEO role, is to say, here's the projection for the company, for our family, for our business, right? And now this is how, we hold accountability, because I set where we should be and I set the projections, and now I can reflect back and say, hey, we're missing our projections. How do we quickly turn this around to make sure we can still hit our projections? Or do we need to adjust, some of our projections, for X, Y, and Z, given the updated information that we do have? So, those are things, just understanding that role within the relationship, so there's a lot of stuff within, the business of relationship that we're working on, especially including the roles, the structure of the family dynamics, expectations, those sorts of things. So again, staying disciplined, creating that structure within your life as well, and then within your relationship, and understanding those roles. Right. And what are our roles? How do we set our roles? Do we even understand how are those roles defined? Right. So then the BOR, keep an eye out on our website. I want to take a moment and pause and give a shout out to one of our sponsors, Cashflow Unlocked. If you haven't checked them out, check out Perry Jeffries and Cashflow Unlocked. They handle a lot of our financial piece as well, and just informing, whether it be our team and informing families. They do a great job at bringing in, they have their own private clients that they deal with as well, personal clients. So if you haven't checked them out, if you haven't taken a look at, some of the workshops that they have coming up, make sure you go. You can check them out on Facebook as well. It's Cashflow Unlocked. And that way you can be in tune on understanding, generational wealth, how to create it, how to, maintain it, and how to go from there. So just wanted to plug that in really quick, because that's something that's been helpful in my mindset as well as a CEO. Is it's not just about going to work and working and making a certain paycheck, right? It's about creating generational wealth, and how do I do that and maintain that? So again, good shout out to them. So really quick, we'll touch on a little bit on that 80-20 rule, and we'll get out of your hair. So a lot of you have heard of the 80-20 rule, and I want to encourage you. take a look right within your relationship. I want you to reevaluate or just evaluate currently within your relationship right now, and building that list, build that list out, not physical attributes of things that you want, right? Internalize it, right? What are the things that I really expect out of my partner, right? I want peace, right? I know for myself, I want peace. I want loyalty, right? I want submission. And when I say submission, not necessarily that I tell you to bark and you bark like a dog. Submission being that you've submitted to the authority, to our plan, right? And you've committed and submitted to that, right? And that vision, right? I also, on my end, I want trust, right? I want support. So can you support? Can you encourage me, to, day to day when maybe I'm having a bad day or this, that, or the other. So there's so many things in that list, right? And then when I take a look at that list, when I take a look day to day, am I getting, on a mostly consistent basis, are you getting 7 out of 10 of those things, right? Are you getting 8 out of 10 of those things, right? So now you're talking about a 70 to 80% rule where, 70 or 80% of the time you're getting what you need, or those things are met. And oftentimes what will happen is that we'll focus on the 20% or the 30% that we're not getting. Right. And there's not a single person out there that is meant to be to give you 100% of what you feel like you may desire or need. Right. That doesn't leave self for you. That doesn't even leave room for God. Where's God at in this relationship? Like, where does he, bring in that fulfillment within your life, within your personal desires and everything else? So if a person is 10 out of 10 or providing 100% of that need mark, then you're so you're so reliant on that person that at the end of the day, there's no you within that. There's just your desires, and there's them fulfilling all of your desires. So taking a look at that and saying, okay, I may not be able to get everything I want right now in this portion of it, but I know that I'm getting 70 or 80%, which to me is that's that projected level. That's that fulfillment level. Right. And so what happens is that over time, when you're receiving that, it becomes so common that now it turns into expectation, right? And not expectation that, hey, because you've been providing this, I'm expecting you to maintain it and keep up. Expected as in you write it away, right? And now it becomes so expected that you can't even appreciate or acknowledge or value when you're receiving it every day, right? So think of it on the end with kids, right? You're expected to provide food and shelter and all of those other things, right? And so you go to work every single day and make sure they have those. Well, what happens, it becomes so expected that they don't even give credit oftentimes for all the hard work you're doing to meet those expectations, right? And those things that they expect from you as a parent. So what happens is they decide to focus on the 20% or 30% of things that they're not getting. Oh, well, you didn't buy me those $300 shoes, or you didn't take me on that vacation like I saw with my friends, and we didn't get to go on. I want to go on a boat ride, or I want this, or I want that, right? So now what happens is in their minds, they lose sight and value and appreciation of what you're providing as a caregiver, because they're not thinking about the 70 or 80% of things that they need at that point in their life, and that is being fulfilled, right? And that you're doing every day and every month, right? That you're doing. And so same thing within the relationship, that person may be providing those things on a daily, every day, right? You may get that loyalty, you may get that communication, right? You may get that, that support, right? But then it becomes so expected that you no longer are giving value or credit to that. And then now all you're focused on is the 20% or the 30% that you feel like you're missing. And oftentimes when I talk to the couples, again, going through doctoral program and finalizing or specializing in mental and behavioral health with specialty in marriage and family, right? After losing out on my own relationships and failing in some aspects of my own relationship, right? It's not to say that, oh, I'm perfect. No, there's a lot of stuff. And because I've had to experience, and because I've placed the focus on that, right, that becomes a passion of mine at this point, that God, how can my situations be utilized to help not only just my family, but other families, which is where, the business of relationship, concept has come from. That how can we collectively work together? What information can I learn and obtain to give to others to help, increase and impact their own personal relationships? But that 80-20, right? Take a look, write that list out. And again, this isn't physical attributes. These are things that, hey, this is important to the success, of my relationship. I want someone that communicates and that's loyal. I want, someone that, and you take a look at your current situation and not what you feel like, that should look like, but are you receiving it? And so, and if you're receiving it, but it's not in a way that, you prefer, then finding a way, how do I get credit for how it is occurring, right? And we can talk through a lot of that later, but a lot of people, when you talk to, people that are ready to, and when I talk to couples that are ready to just call it quits, At the end of the day, you'll realize and you'll find out that 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10 of those things are being met. And quite often, yeah, there's downtimes or there's things where you may not, it may be difficult because it's a hard week or a hard month, right? But for the most part, you're getting that on a consistent basis, or as consistently as possible. But because we don't give credit to that, and because we decide, most of us think negatively, so we focus on some of the negative things in life. So that makes us focus on what we're not receiving. And then half the time, to be honest, we don't really want things to be fixed, right? We want things to remain where they are, because if a person is, in some people's mind, if a person is giving you and fulfilling what we want, then that's a lot of power, for them, where I feel so, I feel so committed and submitted to you that I have to keep some portion, of these negative things in my mind. So I can't give you full credit, for those things, because that's a lot of power to give to somebody. So if I just feel over the head, over the moon for you consistently, that's a lot of power over my emotions and my feelings and everything else. And I don't want to do that, right? Whether it's man or woman, right? And so if I do that, then at the end of the day, then I feel like you'll have too much control over me. So I have to keep some negative thoughts to make sure that I'm not just completely surrendered to you, right? And so keeping that in mind, that subconsciously, sometimes we'll focus on the 20% that we feel like we're not getting, and that 20% will become 100% of our focus, right? Oh my gosh, right now we don't go on date nights. That's important to me, so we don't go on date nights. Well, are you receiving some of the other things? How can, in this season, is there a way to fit date nights in, or will that be a future conversation that maybe, coming up in the future with long hours and everything else, you guys can get date night in there? Are you receiving enough of the other items that are important to you, right? So being in that executive position and being responsible for writing budgets, for companies and things like that, and all of the day-to-day operations, right? I take a look at things like, that may be desired, of the company or the investors or the, even the people on the site, right? Where, hey, I want, all 10 of these things done for my facility, and these are all things that I would love to happen. Well, we take a look at the budget and, available time and everything else. I may not be able to make, 100% of this happen, but how can we prioritize to make sure that, a large portion of what's needed is being met, and so within that, maybe those things are, maybe that 20%, maybe that's something that happens into next year. Right. And so, I take and I replace something that I complete this year. So you're still getting 80% of your desires met, but then we prioritize. Right. So that following year, if you want, money for the roof to be done, and then you also want asphalt done, and then you also want, a complete makeover and renovation of the building, all of that may not happen this year. Right. You also want the elevator. You also want this. You also want this for your department or that department. Right. And so when I take a look at, as we say, hey, how do we prioritize? And within prioritizing, how do we make as much as we can happen? Not that I don't want to make everything happen, but there's only so much time. There's only so much in resources. There's only so much financial resources that are available. And not only that, there are some of those things that, can be handled internally. How do we continue to go and you handle this portion internally as we continue to grow and develop, and then maybe, we'll be able to replace a priority. But it doesn't mean that 100% of what you would like will be met, all the time. So taking a look at that, take a deep dive within your relationship, your expectations, and again, write those things out, write at least the 10 things out. What's important to you within a relationship? And am I receiving, a good portion of those, for the most part? And from there, when you really sit back and you take a look at it, you'll realize, like, man, I fell in love with this person for a reason. Right. I'm with them for a reason. And it's not because nothing's being met. Right. If nothing were being met, then it'd be at a point where, you're living with a friend. You guys are, roommates. But really taking a look, what made you fall in love with that other person in the first place? What makes you want a relationship and have expectations of that relationship out of them? Right. You gave them a role. You gave them a position that they're in. What made you want to do that? And then how are they fulfilling those needs that when you first met them? And even at this point, that growth and development within your relationship, what does that look like? And are you taking proper steps to grow, develop together, right? What's the plan? What's the trajectory? Where are you headed? Do you need a mediator? Do you need a therapist or a counselor, to kind of help mediate some of the conversations, to help you guys to get where you need to go? Therapy, by the way, I make sure, and redirect, hey, how do I get back in and make sure that I'm consistently with my therapist, and then also our couples therapist? How do we do that? So shout out for everybody in the mental health world, the therapy world. If you don't have your own individual therapist or counselor, I'm telling you, it does wonders, and even within your relationship, even if nothing is going on, just having someone, outside of that, just to kind of help you to check in to make sure you guys are hitting your trajectories, hitting your relationship goals, even helping to set those relationship goals can do wonders. So I know there's a lot coming up with the BOR, the business of relationship. This was just a quick podcast. Again, thank you for those that are tuning in. For those that are interested in more information about our BOR and our workshop and upcoming events, again, check us out at bor-kingdom.com. I'm your host, Mike Bell. I look forward to seeing you at the next podcast.